Icons are usually explained as triumphs of vision, a brilliant idea, a bold design, and uncompromising execution. That is how we like to tell these stories. What we tend to skip is the constraint that made the vision survivable. The Mustang did not begin as a pure expression of what Ford wanted to build. It began as a negotiation with what Ford could afford, what it could produce quickly, and what it already understood well enough not to break. The platform choice at the center of the Mustang story was not meant to define the car. It was meant to disappear, reuse the structure, hide the compromise, let styling and marketing do the work. That was the plan. From the inside, the platform decision was practical. It saved time. It controlled cost. It reduced uncertainty in manufacturing and supply chains. It allowed Ford to move before the market fully settled. It was not treated as creative. It was treated as containment. The assumption was simple. Buyers would not care what the Mustang was built on. They would respond to how it looked, how it felt, and what it suggested about who they could be behind the wheel. And at first, that assumption seemed correct. But over time, the decision Ford tried hardest to make invisible became the one that shaped everything else. Because the platform imposed limits that could not be ignored. Limits on handling, limits on balance, limits on how far the car could be pushed without changing its nature. Those limits did something unexpected. They forced the Mustang to choose what it was not going to be. It could not chase every performance benchmark. It could not promise dominance in every configuration. It could not escalate endlessly without losing coherence. Instead, it learned how to live between categories. Not a pure sports car, not a family sedan, not an exclusive performance machine, something else. That something else was not the result of perfect planning. It emerged because the platform would not allow the car to become everything at once. In other words, compromise created identity. This episode is about that inversion, about how a decision made to limit risk ended up enabling longevity, about how constraint created flexibility, about why the Mustang endured while other cars built on pure vision struggled to adapt. We often assume that icons are born from refusing to compromise. The Mustang suggests the opposite. That compromise, when understood and managed rather than denied, can become the structure that allows meaning to accumulate over time. To understand how that happened, we have to look past the styling and the mythology and focus on the decision Ford expected no one to notice. The platform choice that was never meant to matter, and how it quietly made everything else possible. Part 1. The platform decision that was meant to stay invisible. When Ford chose the platform for the Mustang, the decision was treated as infrastructure. It was something to be settled early, quietly, and then moved past. The real work, in most people's minds, would happen above it. Design, marketing, positioning, the things customers actually saw. Platforms were not supposed to be expressive. They were supposed to be dependable. Using an existing compact platform fit that logic perfectly. It reduced cost. It shortened development time. It kept manufacturing predictable. It allowed the Mustang project to exist without demanding wholesale changes to how Ford operated. That was the appeal. From a leadership perspective, the platform decision lowered the temperature of the entire proposal. It made the Mustang feel manageable, less like a leap and more like an extension. This was not a car that would require new factories, new supply chains, or new ways of building cars. It would be assembled using systems Ford already trusted. That mattered more than style sketches at this stage. Inside large organizations, projects survive not because they are exciting, but because they are legible. The platform choice made the Mustang legible to the people responsible for approving it. It signaled discipline. Engineers knew what they were dealing with. Manufacturing teams recognized the architecture. Finance could model costs with confidence. Risk could be bounded. All of that was intentional. The expectation was that the platform would fade into the background once the car launched. Buyers would respond to the shape, the name, the promise. The structure underneath would remain invisible, doing its job quietly. In that sense, the platform choice was meant to protect the Mustang from scrutiny. If something went wrong, Ford would understand why. If something went right, no one would ask how the foundation had been built. That invisibility was a feature. It allowed the Mustang to carry emotional weight without forcing the organization to stake its reputation on a technical gamble. What Ford did not anticipate was how difficult it would be to keep that decision invisible over time, because platforms do not just support products, they shape behavior. The constraints embedded in the Mustang's platform were not temporary. They could not be styled away completely. They influenced proportions, suspension tuning, weight distribution, and performance ceilings. Those influences were subtle at first. Early buyers were not analyzing chassis geometry. They were responding to the car's presence. The platform did its job quietly. But as the Mustang began to be driven harder, talked about more, and compared to other cars, the platform's influence became harder to ignore. It did not undermine the car. It defined its boundaries. And those boundaries mattered. Ford had assumed that identity would come from what the Mustang added. Design cues, options, marketing narratives. Instead, identity began to emerge from what the car could not do easily. It could not chase extremes without consequences. It could not escalate endlessly without breaking something. It could not pretend to be a pure performance machine in every form. Those limitations forced restraint. And restraint, over time, became character. This is the part of the story that is easy to miss. The platform decision was not visionary. It was pragmatic. It was made to reduce risk and preserve control. But by setting limits early, Ford unintentionally created a framework within which the Mustang could evolve without losing itself. The car had edges it could push against without tearing apart. That would matter later, when success created pressure to become more than the platform could safely support. At the moment of the decision, none of that was visible. The platform choice looked like housekeeping, something to be settled and forgotten. In reality, it was the most consequential decision Ford made about the Mustang's future, not because it enabled everything, but because it prevented too much. And in doing so, it shaped the kind of icon the Mustang could become. The platform was meant to stay invisible. Instead, it became the quiet structure that held the story together. Part 2. What the platform could not do. The platform Ford chose for the Mustang was reliable, familiar, and efficient. It was not limitless. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit at the time. From an engineering perspective, the constraints were immediately clear. The suspension geometry was designed for predictability, not aggression. Weight distribution favored stability over balance. Structural tolerances allowed for everyday use, not repeated punishment at the edge of performance. None of this made the platform bad. It made it specific. The problem was that specificity does not disappear just because a car looks fast. As the Mustang entered the market and enthusiasm grew, the car began to be asked to do things. Its foundation was not designed to support uniformly. Harder driving, faster cornering, higher expectations across trims that shared the same underlying structure. Engineers understood where those limits were. They also understood that limits are rarely respected once a product becomes symbolic. The Mustang was not marketed as a race car, but it looked like one. That visual promise invited comparison. Comparison invited pressure. This is where the platform's inability to do certain things became as important as what it could do. It could not deliver peak performance across every configuration without escalating cost and complexity rapidly. It could not chase European handling standards without redesigning the very structure that made it affordable. It could not absorb endless power increases without compromising durability and safety. Those ceilings were real, and they were permanent. Ford could improve around the edges. Better brakes, revised suspension tuning, stronger components. But the core geometry remained what it was. That reality forced choices. The company had to decide how far to push the car without pretending it was something else. It had to balance image with honesty, performance with believability. This is where the platform's limitations began to shape behavior rather than restrict it. Because Ford could not make the Mustang everything at once, it had to be selective. It had to define what mattered most and accept trade-offs openly, even if those trade-offs were not advertised. The platform prevented the Mustang from becoming singular. It could not dominate one category so completely that it abandoned others. It could not become so focused that it alienated the buyers who made it viable at scale. In a different context, that might have been a weakness. Here, it became a constraint that encouraged balance. Competitors often built cars around a singular goal: maximum performance, pure sport, absolute image. Those cars could excel briefly and then struggle to adapt when conditions changed. The Mustang's platform made that kind of purity difficult, and that difficulty turned out to be protective. The car could be many things in limited ways rather than one thing perfectly. It could accommodate a wide range of buyers without breaking its identity. It could evolve incrementally without demanding reinvention. None of that was intentional at the outset. It emerged because the platform said no when ambition exceeded structure. Inside Ford Motor Company, those limits were sometimes frustrating. Engineers wanted more freedom. Marketers wanted stronger claims. Enthusiasts wanted clearer answers. But the platform enforced discipline. It reminded the organization that every promise had to be supported by something tangible. That escalation had consequences. That performance without restraint would eventually expose the foundation. This is the paradox at the heart of the Mustang story. The platform could not do everything, and because of that, the Mustang could endure. The limitations that once looked like liabilities became the boundaries that preserved coherence as the car's reputation grew. The platform did not define the Mustang's ceiling. It defined its shape. And shape, in the long run, matters more than peak. Because cars that chase the top often burn out. Cars that learn where their edges are tend to last. The Mustang's platform taught Ford where those edges lived, not through theory, but through constraint. And that constraint would soon begin to do something even more unexpected. It would force the Mustang to decide what kind of car it actually was. Part 3. How limitations forced identity. The Mustang did not arrive with a fully formed identity. It arrived with boundaries. Those boundaries mattered because they eliminated certain paths before Ford ever had to choose between them. The platform made it clear what the car could not become without breaking its own logic. That clarity forced definition. Ford could not honestly position the Mustang as a pure sports car. The platform would not support that promise consistently across the lineup, nor could it present the car as a practical family vehicle without undermining the very appeal that drew buyers in the first place. So the Mustang settled into an in-between space, not because it was planned that way, but because the structure demanded it. This is where limitation becomes formative rather than restrictive. Because the Mustang could not dominate any single category without compromise, it was free to borrow selectively from several. It took visual cues from performance cars. It borrowed accessibility from everyday transportation. It allowed personalization without exclusivity. The platform forced restraint in how far each of those elements could go. That restraint kept the car believable. Ford avoided absolute claims. Marketing language leaned toward suggestion rather than assertion. The Mustang was framed as sporty, energetic, youthful. Not fastest, not most advanced, not uncompromising. Those choices were often interpreted as caution. In reality, they were alignment. The platform made overpromising dangerous. Any claim that exceeded what the structure could support would eventually be tested in public. Ford learned quickly that honesty, even when implicit, preserved trust. This honesty did not mean transparency in a technical sense. It meant staying within a range of expectations the car could reliably meet. That range became the Mustang's identity. It was a car that looked faster than it needed to be. That felt exciting without demanding expertise. That allowed buyers to project meaning onto it without forcing Ford to defend absolutes. The platform prevented extremes, and by preventing extremes, it created space. Space for multiple interpretations. Space for different trims to coexist without contradiction. Space for the car to mean different things to different people. This ambiguity was not weakness. It was flexibility disguised as limitation. Cars built around singular visions tend to resolve quickly. They peak when conditions favor them and struggle when those conditions change. The Mustang, constrained early, never fully committed to a single definition. It did not have to unlearn an identity later. The platform made that possible. Because the Mustang could not be everything, it did not have to defend being anything in particular. That subtlety is easy to overlook. We often celebrate identity as something declared boldly. In practice, durable identity is often something that emerges from what is consistently avoided. The Mustang avoided claiming dominance. It avoided promising purity. It avoided closing off alternative interpretations. Those avoidances were enforced by the platform. and they shaped how the car aged. As expectations grew and competitors chased clearer definitions, the Mustang remained legible. It could absorb performance variance without redefining itself. It could accommodate base models without apology. The platform ensured that no single version could eclipse the whole. That balance would prove crucial, because icons rarely fail at their peak. They fail when they are asked to become more of what they already are. The Mustang's platform made that kind of escalation difficult. It forced moderation. And moderation, in this case, became endurance. The Mustang's identity was not engineered. It was constrained into existence. By the time the car was widely understood, that identity felt intentional. It was not. It was the result of limits that refused to be ignored. And those limits had one more consequence. Ford did not anticipate. They made the Mustang easier to evolve than cars built on purer visions. Which is where the story goes next. Part 4. The flexibility. The compromise created. The platform that constrained the Mustang also made it unusually adaptable. That adaptability was not obvious at first. In the early years, the focus was on meeting demand, managing expectations, and keeping the car within the boundaries the platform imposed. Flexibility emerged later as a byproduct of familiarity. Because Ford understood the platform deeply, changes did not require reinvention. Adjustments could be layered rather than rebuilt. Power could increase in measured steps. Suspension could be tuned without destabilizing the whole. New trims could be introduced without forcing a fundamental rethink of what the car was. That mattered. Cars built on more radical foundations often face a different problem. Their defining feature becomes a constraint of its own. Any deviation risks breaking the promise that made them special in the first place. The Mustang did not have that problem. Its promise was broad enough to accommodate change. The platform enabled incrementalism. That word often sounds unambitious, but here it was strategic. Incremental change allowed Ford to respond to the market without overcommitting. It allowed learning to happen in public without turning every update into a referendum on identity. When buyers wanted more performance, Ford could add it selectively. When buyers wanted affordability, the base car could remain intact. When regulations shifted or tastes evolved, the structure underneath did not require replacement. This is where compromise reveals its second-order effects. The platform reduced the cost of change, not just financially, but organizationally. Engineers knew where adjustments were safe. Manufacturing understood what could be altered without disruption. Dealers could explain variations without confusion. That shared understanding is rare. It is usually earned through time, not planning. The Mustang's platform gave Ford time. Time to observe how buyers actually used the car. Time to see which variants resonated and which did not. Time to correct without admitting failure. That patience is often mistaken for conservatism. In reality, it was agility. Because Ford was not locked into a singular expression of the Mustang, it could evolve the car without resetting expectations. Changes felt like growth rather than correction. Competitors struggled with this. Cars designed to embody a single idea often face a stark choice when the market shifts. They either double down or retreat. Both options carry risk. The Mustang, constrained early, avoided that trap. It could absorb new influences without abandoning its core. It could change gradually without signaling crisis. That flexibility extended beyond hardware. Marketing could adjust tone without contradiction. Performance variants could coexist with restrained models. The Mustang could be many things at once because it had never claimed to be one thing exclusively. The platform made that possible by preventing extremes. It enforced continuity. And continuity is what allows icons to persist across eras. The irony is that none of this was the goal. The platform was chosen to reduce risk, not to create adaptability. Yet by lowering the cost of change, it gave Ford room to respond intelligently over time. Compromise did not just limit what the Mustang could be, it expanded what it could become. That expansion did not happen through bold reinvention. It happened through accumulation, small changes layered onto a stable foundation. Over years, those layers became history. And that history mattered more than any single specification. The Mustang did not survive because it was perfected early. It survived because it could adjust without collapsing. The platform made that adjustment possible, and as the car's reputation grew, that quiet flexibility would become one of its most important and least celebrated advantages, because endurance is rarely built on brilliance alone. It is built on structures that allow change without rupture. The Mustang had one of those structures, and it came from a compromise no one expected to matter. Part 5. When compromise became a feature. There is a moment in the life of every enduring product when its limitations stop being defended and start being valued. For the Mustang, that moment arrived quietly. As the car matured, buyers began to understand it, not as a singular statement, but as a range, a spectrum that allowed entry without exclusion and aspiration without commitment to extremes. What once looked like compromise started to look like choice. The Mustang was not the fastest car in every configuration. It was not the sharpest handler across the board. It did not dominate a single performance metric consistently, and that was precisely why more people could see themselves in it. The platform's constraints made the Mustang legible to a wide audience. Enthusiasts could find versions that pushed the limits of what the structure allowed. Casual buyers could choose models that delivered style and identity without demanding specialized knowledge or tolerance for harsh trade-offs. This coexistence was rare. Cars built around purity tend to narrow over time. They become better at one thing and worse at accommodating others. Their audience tightens. Their meaning sharpens, then hardens. The Mustang avoided that trajectory. Its compromises created space for multiple relationships with the same object: a first car, a weekend car, a performance project, a daily driver, a cultural symbol. The platform made sure none of those roles overwhelmed the rest. That balance mattered as expectations evolved. As horsepower wars intensified and competitors chased clearer extremes, the Mustang remained approachable. It could acknowledge performance culture without becoming captive to it. It could evolve without demanding reverence. This is where compromise becomes structural advantage. Because the car was never defined by perfection, it was not diminished by imperfection. Flaws did not contradict the story. They were already part of it. Buyers did not expect the Mustang to be everything. They expected it to be something they could shape. That expectation aligned perfectly with the platform's realities. Customization flourished, not because the Mustang was incomplete, but because it was adaptable. The underlying structure allowed variation without collapse. Owners could modify, personalize, and interpret without breaking the car's identity. The Mustang did not resist that behavior. It invited it. In doing so, it became less like a finished product and more like a framework. That is a subtle shift, but a powerful one. Frameworks endure where monuments do not. A monument demands preservation. A framework invites participation. The Mustang's compromises made participation possible. They lowered the barrier to entry. They reduced the intimidation factor. They allowed aspiration without exclusivity. This is often misread as dilution. In practice, it was expansion. The Mustang did not lose meaning by being many things to many people. It gained resilience. Because when one interpretation faded, others remained. That resilience traces directly back to the platform decision. The compromise that once looked like a constraint became the reason the Mustang could absorb cultural shifts without losing coherence. The car did not have to defend purity. It only had to remain recognizable. And that, in the long run, proved far more valuable. What Ford had unintentionally built was not just a car, but a container. One that could hold different desires at different times without cracking. That container existed because the platform refused to let any single version define the whole. Compromise did not weaken the Mustang. It gave it room to breathe. And that breathing room would soon matter even more as the automotive landscape grew crowded with icons that could not adapt. Which brings us to the contrast that reveals the Mustang's advantage most clearly: the cars that collapsed under the weight of their own perfection. Part 6. The icons that collapse without constraint. The cars that burn brightest often disappear first. History is full of vehicles built around a singular idea: maximum performance, radical styling, absolute purity of purpose. For a moment they feel undeniable. They define an era, dominate headlines, and set benchmarks others scramble to reach. And then the context changes. What made them special becomes what traps them. Cars built without meaningful constraints tend to harden around their original promise. Any deviation feels like betrayal. Any adjustment looks like retreat. Improvement becomes escalation because refinement would require admitting limits that were never acknowledged. That escalation rarely ends well. Power increases. Strain structures never designed to carry it indefinitely. Styling grows exaggerated as designers chase distinction instead of coherence. Prices climb as complexity replaces balance. The audience narrows, then fractures. Eventually, the car becomes too much of itself. The Mustang avoided that fate because it never pretended to be pure. The platform ensured that there was always a ceiling, a point beyond which the car could not go without fundamentally changing what it was. That ceiling acted as a governor on ambition, not a brake, a boundary. Boundaries force choices. They require trade-offs to be named even if they are not advertised. They prevent endless escalation by making consequences visible early. They keep products from drifting into extremes that only a shrinking audience can tolerate. Cars built on uncompromised visions often lack those checks. When success arrives, it reinforces the original idea. When pressure builds, the response is to intensify what already worked. More power, more aggression, more exclusivity. That path can be thrilling. It is rarely durable. The Mustang's platform made that path difficult. It could not absorb infinite escalation without losing mass appeal. It could not chase niche dominance without undermining its own logic. Each push toward purity exposed a cost that had to be weighed against what would be lost. Those trade-offs slowed the car's drift toward extremity. They also preserved optionality. When taste shifted, the Mustang did not need to reinvent itself. It needed to recalibrate. When regulations changed, the structure could accommodate adjustments without collapse. When competitors surged and faded, the Mustang remained legible. This is the difference between cars that peak and cars that persist. Peak cars are remembered for what they were at their height. Persistent cars are remembered for how long they stayed relevant. The Mustang belongs to the second category. Its constraints prevented it from chasing every trend. They forced it to carry continuity forward, even as details changed. That continuity allowed meaning to accumulate rather than reset. Icons that collapse often do so because they are too tightly coupled to a single moment. Their excellence is context-dependent. When the context shifts, the product has nowhere to go. The Mustang's platform decoupled it from any one moment. It anchored the car in something stable enough to survive changing tastes without demanding reinvention. That stability was not glamorous. It did not generate headlines, but it kept the car alive. The irony is that the Mustang is often remembered alongside cars that flamed out. It is discussed in the same breath as short-lived icons, as if they shared the same trajectory. They did not. The difference was not vision or talent or even ambition. It was constraint. The Mustang had one, and that constraint made it resilient in a way pure designs could not match. This is why compromise, when understood properly, is not weakness. It is insulation. It absorbs shocks. It spreads stress. It allows movement without fracture. The Mustang's platform provided that insulation, and in doing so, it quietly separated the car from a long list of icons that shone briefly, then vanished when the world moved on. The cars that collapse without constraints are easier to remember at their peak. The cars that endure are harder to explain, because endurance rarely looks dramatic in the moment. It looks like moderation, and moderation, in this case, is what made the Mustang last. Part 7. What Ford learned without fully naming it. Ford did not hold a meeting to declare that compromise had become a strength. There was no internal framework, no formal doctrine, no memo explaining how the platform decision had quietly reshaped the company's understanding of durability. What Ford learned from the Mustang was absorbed indirectly through practice rather than proclamation. That is often how organizations learn what they are not prepared to admit explicitly. The Mustang showed that limits could protect identity rather than weaken it. That familiarity with a structure could create freedom instead of stagnation. That evolution did not require reinvention if the foundation was stable enough to carry change. Those insights never became slogans. They became instincts. Future projects were evaluated with a slightly different posture. Not reckless, not radical, but less allergic to imperfection. There was a growing recognition that shipping something bounded and adaptable could be wiser than waiting for something pristine. This did not mean Ford abandoned discipline. It meant discipline was applied differently. Instead of optimizing every dimension up front, the company became more willing to sequence decisions, to allow products to develop meaning over time rather than forcing clarity at launch, to treat identity as something that could emerge rather than something that had to be declared. That shift was subtle. It did not announce itself in strategy decks. It showed up in how arguments were resolved, and how much uncertainty was tolerated before a decision stalled, and how often leaders asked whether a structure could absorb change instead of whether a product could dominate immediately. The Mustang had demonstrated that coherence mattered more than peak performance, that a product could remain legible across versions and eras if its core boundaries were respected. Those boundaries were not glamorous, but they were effective. Inside Ford Motor Company, the Mustang became a reference, not because it was perfect, but because it endured. It survived cycles that eliminated competitors. It adapted without losing its name or its place in the culture. That endurance reframed success. Instead of asking whether something could win decisively, Ford became more attuned to whether it could last, whether it could absorb pressure without splintering, whether it could evolve without needing to explain itself anew every few years. This learning was incomplete. As with any success story, parts of the lesson were simplified. Boldness was remembered more clearly than restraint, outcome more clearly than structure. But the influence was still there, operating beneath the surface. Ford did not set out to build a philosophy of compromise. It stumbled into one, and that philosophy mattered because it ran counter to the myth that icons are built by refusing limits. The Mustang suggested something quieter. That limits, if acknowledged early, can become the reason an icon survives long enough to matter. That realization never needed to be named to be felt. It lived in how decisions were paced, in how promises were phrased, in how escalation was resisted when it threatened coherence. The Mustang did not just change what Ford built, it changed how Ford thought about what was worth protecting, not perfection. And continuity in the long run is what allows meaning to accumulate rather than reset. That is what Ford learned, quietly, imperfectly, but decisively. Part 8. What compromise leaves behind. We often talk about compromise as if it is something to overcome, something to fix, something to refine away once success allows it. The Mustang tells a different story. The compromise at the heart of the Mustang was never resolved. The platform limits never disappeared. They were not outgrown or erased by success. They stayed. And because they stayed, the car had to stay honest. It could not become everything. It could not chase every trend. It could not redefine itself completely without paying a visible cost. Those constraints did not weaken the Mustang. They protected it. They prevented the car from drifting so far in one direction that it lost the ability to return. They kept the identity legible even as details changed. They made continuity possible in a category where reinvention often destroys recognition. What compromise left behind was not a flaw. It was a structure that allowed change without collapse, a framework that invited interpretation without confusion, a foundation that could absorb pressure instead of amplifying it. The Mustang is often remembered as an icon of boldness. It is more accurate to remember it as an icon of restraint, not timid restraint, deliberate restraint, the kind that accepts limits early so it does not have to defend purity later, the kind that allows growth without escalation, the kind that understands that endurance is built from coherence, not dominance. The platform compromise was never meant to matter. It was meant to stay invisible. Instead, it became the reason the Mustang could survive success. That is the paradox at the center of this story. Icons are not always born from refusing compromise. Sometimes they are born from choosing the right one and living with it long enough for meaning to accumulate around it. The Mustang endured because it was never allowed to become perfect. It was allowed to become recognizable. And in a world that changes faster than products can be redesigned, recognizability is not a weakness. It is an advantage. That is what the platform compromise created. Not just a car, but a way for a car to last. Subscribe to Classic Wheels and Tales for long-form stories about the cars, the people, and the decisions that shaped automotive history. Each episode explores a moment where limits mattered more than ambition and why that often makes all the difference.